Well, Dean, thank you very much. I think that one of the most difficult challenges I face, apart from being very short, I hope you can see me, is listening to people introduce me, because I feel not powerful at all. Having two vested interests in Columbia University who made sure that I should appear here today, my son and my nephew, who was skulking in the background somewhere. Hi. So I'm very honored to be here. It's a pleasure because I get to meet so many young people, and I already interacted with some of them before the lecture. I feel totally energized. Also, tremendous respect for this institution, which is educating many of the people who will be resources back in Africa. So before I start, before I even tell you what I want to talk about, I just want to do a quick survey. This is about the assets of Africa, right? And the assets of Africa, the biggest set of assets we have, are not the natural resources that are found in our countries, but the people, including you in this very room. I see many Africans and friends and lovers of Africa. So how many of you believe your assets? Hands up. Okay. How many of you intend to deploy those assets to the benefit of your countries? Great. So does that mean you're heading back as soon as you get your degree? How many are heading back? Or heading to help? Great. Okay. I'm even more encouraged. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a little bit about looking at Africa as an opportunity. I think many people know that I focus on that because for many, many reasons, people forget what the opportunities are of this continent, because most of the time it's a continent about war, conflict, fragility, lack of democracy, a continent of challenges. But I always prefer to look at it the other way around, because I think that after a decade now of growth, Africa has shown that it's really about opportunities. And I also want to talk a little bit about this crisis and the impact of the crisis on the continent, and what the World Bank is doing about it, and what we could all be doing. I want to put a benchmark with Hillary Clinton's words that you should never waste a good crisis. I think we need to apply that to the African case. So let me start by talking a little bit about the performance of the continent prior to these crises, and then I want to, as I said, talk about the crisis and how it has impacted Africa, what we're trying to do about it. Until 2008, until last year, sub-Saharan Africa had been experiencing sustained and accelerating economic growth for over a decade. And this is against the backdrop of a continent that had been performing so badly. After posting an average growth rate of about 5.5% from 1995 to 2005, the growth rate accelerated to almost 6% in 2006, and was forecast by both the World Bank and the IMF to surpass 6% going forward. This resurgence of growth was not just about growth alone. It also had an impact on poverty, on the poverty rate. Since 1995, the percentage of Africans living on less than $1.25 a day, which is the new poverty benchmark that has been established, fell from 57% to 50%. About twice as fast a rate of decline as that in South Asia. I don't think this is something that is commonly known because the problem is so large, but there was a poverty impact of this growth. Other things have been achieved. There were rapid increases in primary school enrollment around the continent. In universal completion of primary education, some countries such as Benin, Guinea, Madagascar, Mozambique, Rwanda, and Niger performed extremely well, and looked at globally, they were among the leaders, albeit from a low base. While child mortality continued to increase in countries such as Botswana, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, and Lesotho, there were successes in certain areas, such as massive vaccination of children for measles, and reduction of measles death by about 75%. These things are important because one of the things we worry about are the human development indicators on the continent. And what we see is that we were beginning to have improvements in pockets. And finally, as you all know, that HIV/AIDS, which had become the major development issue and global health and security challenge for the continent, appeared to be slowing its spread, with the prevalence rate beginning to show a decline for the first time. So there were emerging indicators of a turnaround, and even though most African countries were not really on track for achieving the Millennium Development Goals, some of them were on track to achieve some of these goals, as we see. And if this trend continued, if not 2015, perhaps by 2020 or 2025, many of them will be attaining these goals. So what were the factors in this turnaround? I think it's important to talk about them, because you'll see later on that one of the key things that we have to do is to make sure we maintain what works. The first was, there's no question, is the fact that the countries undertook a number of very important, sometimes painful, macroeconomic reforms to stabilize their economies, bring down the rate of inflation, tackle their fiscal deficits, implement appropriate monetary policies, and so on. Sometimes these reforms are controversial, particularly when you work at the World Bank or the IMF, because many people feel, well, I'm from the World Bank, so I speak only for the World Bank, that some of these reforms can be quite painful. But if you sit on the other side of the table, as I did as finance minister, you will note, as I said to many of our labor leaders and our citizens, that you have to tackle your fundamental problems. You really cannot grow the economy unless you have macroeconomic stability. So you need to do what it takes. So we needed to grow up. I even use that word. And not think in terms of looking for who we're going to say is making us do what we need to do, but instead to stand back, as we did with the Nigeria program during those 3 years I was finance minister, and say, what are the fundamental challenges we face? Craft our own reform program, which when we did it was tougher than any program the fund or the bank had been trying to get us to do, because we recognized that at the end of the day these things had to be done and implemented. And I think what we see in these figures is that many African countries did begin to do that. Some reluctantly at first, but increasingly there was a recognition with very good results. Inflation rates were brought down. As I said, the macro imbalances were tackled. And except for a few countries, these gains began to show. And this was what was fundamental then to tackling other issues in the growth of the countries. I think the second factor, no doubt, was that there was an increase or a rapid rise in commodity prices in the early to mid-2000s, which contributed to this growth. But the important point is that this rise in commodity prices was managed in a different way from the past. Those countries that were lucky to be able to export these commodities and benefit from sometimes the windfall gains, save them in a manner that enabled them to be used increasingly towards the real development, the development of the real sectors of the economy. I can also say that from our side, this commodity boom, which in Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, and some other countries was an oil boom, but in other countries, other metals and minerals, a lot of it was saved. So we learned something from our past mistakes, where we would spend everything that was done during a boom. We also learned from the East Asians, who, as you see, saw after the crisis in the late 90s, began massive reserve accumulation and savings to be able to self-insure in their economic management and cushion themselves in the event of a crisis.